I just wanted to go through a presentation on global and regional growth numbers, well, actually contraction numbers for 2020 in particular, just to give an idea of what to expect in the region in terms of GDP. In the first place, as you can see from the chart that's depicting global GDP growth, and these are all IMF numbers that would have come out last week when the IMF released their World Economic Outlook. And as you can see, growth is expected to decline. Global GDP, that is, sorry, is expected to decline by 3% this year. And the head of the IMF has said that it's an estimate, and it's possible that they can revise this even lower in terms of a wider contraction. And they're expecting that GDP will rebound somewhat in 2021. Now, again, that depends on how long a recovery process takes, how long it takes to get a vaccine and to get wider testing going and so on. So there are a lot of variables that are not yet known. So this is their best estimate so far. So chances are that these estimates will be revised again. Now, on the next slide, we are looking at Caribbean growth for 2019. So last year, most economies in the Caribbean saw positive growth, except for Barbados, which, as we know, is in an IMF-assisted program. And we have Curacao and Haiti that also contracted. Now, apart from those few, you can see that most economies in the region were doing pretty well. Some of them, like Dominica, is an outlier, and that's simply because of the recovery post-hurricane. But most countries in the region were looking pretty good in terms of their growth just before the COVID-19 hit, even though the global economy was already in a recession last year. Now, if we look at the chart that shows us what the Caribbean is going to look like this year, Guyana is, according to the IMF, going to be the only economy that's going to show positive growth this year. And originally that number was supposed to be somewhere around 86%. And now they're looking at 52.8%, partly based on some of the political challenges they've had, and continue to have, but also mostly because of the oil price effect, which is probably going to have an effect on production as well, given that current international oil prices are below Guyana's lifting costs and certainly their break-even costs. Now, every other country in the region is going to contract this year. Most of these are IMF numbers that were released in the World Economic Outlook. And if you look at these numbers, most of them are 10% and below contraction. I actually think that these numbers are quite optimistic. And the reason I say that is in Bermuda, which I know it doesn't really count as a Caribbean country, but they have a similar economic structure to many of us, and certainly certain parallels with respect to our history. Bermuda announced just last week that they are expecting their economy to contract between 7.5% and 12.5%. And that's based on some guidance and advice that they've gotten from CARTAC, which is the IMF's Regional Technical Assistance Center. Now, if Bermuda, which has a pretty strong balance sheet and a pretty strong economy, is going to contract between 7.5% and 12.5% this year, it suggests to me that some of the weaker economies in the Caribbean are also going to contract at higher numbers. And if we look at the Cayman Islands, for example, this is not a number that this negative 15% is not a number from the IMF. They don't put out numbers for Cayman, but this is a number that the government is working with. The Cayman Islands is one of the, if not the strongest economy in the region in terms of its fiscal buffers, in terms of the fact that they've had consistent growth between 2 to 3% for the past few years. They had unemployment that was at the lowest level ever, and their economy was really booming, and they're expecting a 15% contraction. And I'm saying all of this to say that countries like certainly the whole Eastern Caribbean, even Trinidad and Tobago, I don't think Trinidad and Tobago is going to get 4.5% contraction. I think it's going to be much steeper than that. And so this chart is showing you what we expect based on what the IMF has put out. But I would suggest that for most countries, it's going to be a lot worse. Now, if we go to the next slide, this chart is showing you what the 2009 global financial crisis looked like. And I'm putting this here just so that we get a comparison, because the IMF has said, which is depicted in the first slide, that the contraction this year is going to be worse than what we saw in 2009. So again, the only countries in this chart that are showing double-digit contraction are Antigua and Bermuda and Aruba. And this year is going to be worse than 2009 for them and for the rest of the economies. And so this again gives you some sort of a, I guess, a floor that we're working with in terms of this is what the minimum contraction is going to look like for these economies. I will update this as things change, and I welcome your comments and your feedback. It's a very fluid situation and things are changing all the time, and I'll do my best to keep you updated. We are dealing with unprecedented challenges, and economic contraction is on the cards. We have to then figure out how to deal with it and how best to come out of this in the best shape possible. Thank you.
Be sure to sign up for my free monthly Caribbean economic report by going to marladukharan.com/insights and enter your name and your email address so you'll never miss an edition of my monthly economic report.